Okay, well, after a little break, I've managed to upload the first part to YouTube, hopefully, and I'm moving on to the second part, which of course broke in the middle of the United States versus EC Knight case. So let me just go back to the bottom of this slide before we move on to the next slide, which has another really exciting picture for you all. Let's pull this back up. So as I was saying before we got interrupted by the time limit for YouTube, regulation in the case of the United States versus EC Knight of refining was considered to be an indirect impact on commerce. And because of its indirect component, it doesn't make it to the state of having an effect on interstate commerce. So the intent of the manufacturer does not mean that it is entering commerce. So this might be helped by looking at my next little graphic. I understand that I am a very bad artist. But what we've got here, as you can see, is the Gibbons component, right? So here's interstate commerce. That is a train. Gibbons gives us this in terms of what interstate commerce is. United States versus EC Knight suggests that there's these barriers here between what's happening intrastate. So here's our manufacturing sugar refining plant. At some point, it enters interstate commerce, which would be here, and then it stops being an interstate commerce as it enters this other state over here, and then the sugar is distributed to all of the people who are stick figures. So EC Knight gives us a very clear indication of where commerce starts and stops. And that if you're going to have some sort of effect on interstate commerce, it has to be more than an indirect effect, right? And so they say on page 411 in the book, contracts, combinations, or conspiracies to control domestic enterprise in manufacture, agriculture, mining, production in all its forms, or to raise or lower prices or wages might unquestionably tend to restrain external as well as domestic trade, but the restraint would be an indirect result, however inevitable and whatever its extent, and such result would not necessarily determine the object of the contract, combination, or conspiracy. There's a lot of language in here about indirect results. Now, one of course the implications here is that regulating monopolies is going to be pretty hard to do at the federal level. The states might try to do something to intervene, but the federal government is having its hands tied in terms of trying to use interstate commerce at least to regulate monopolies. And it establishes this notion of a direct effect on commerce. Manufacturing is an indirect effect, according to this case, and so you can't regulate it. And so it gives us a sort of starting point for what the direct effect is. So that's one part. So we know that commerce includes navigation. We know that it doesn't include manufacture of goods or any of the ways in which we might want to regulate the workplace environment prior to the institution of that navigation. Which brings us to the next component, which is the stream of commerce doctrine. And this seems most logically compelling in terms of what we think of when we think of interstate commerce. And that brings us to the case of Stafford versus Wallace, which is a 1922 case dealing with the Packers and Stockyard Act of 1921. So even today, meatpacking and stockyards are one of the underbellies of the food industry. And one of the things that Congress sought to do was regulate the ways in which meatpacking and stockyards existed and the ways in which they worked, including allowing the Department of Agriculture the authority to set rates, create rules, and carry out the particular act. And remember, we talked about all the ways in which the executive branch does that. This brings us to the fourth question that you need to answer, so you can pause the video as you do this. But in Stafford versus Wallace, it establishes the stream of commerce doctrine. What does the stream of commerce doctrine cover? That's the question. Obviously, manufacture is not part of that stream of commerce. So what do they mean when they say stream of commerce? Oops, let me go back real fast. Just to give you a few quotes to go from. At the beginning of that case, the Chief Justice, which is Chief Justice Taft at the time, says the object to be secured by the act is the free and unburdened flow of livestock from the ranges and farms of the West and the Southwest through the great stockyards and slaughtering centers on the borders of that region, and thence in the form of meat products to the consuming cities of the country in the Middle West and East, or still as livestock to the feeding places and fattening farms in the Middle West or East for further preparation for the market. So one of the things that's important here, right, is that you've got farms on one side, and we're going to see this again when we get into the sick chicken case, but you've got farms on one side where animals are living. They get on a truck or some kind of vehicle. They stop in a meat packing area. So again, they're sort of taken off of the truck, so they're no longer in transportation. Something happens to them. They're either slaughtered and made into meat, or they're put back on a truck and brought to a city where they're disposed of for final consumption. So the question is, if you've stopped at a meat packing plant in between the range in the west and the food consumer in the east, have you exited some component of interstate commerce, or do you remain in interstate commerce even though you are now engaged in some kind of other activity? So whereas the manufacturing in the earlier case started intrastate and then it entered the stream of commerce and ended in a different state, here the question is, what happens when animals, in this case cows, stop in the middle of their transportation process and then move forward? This is what gives us the stream of commerce doctrine. So what I want you to do is look at what the stream of commerce doctrine covers based upon the case law that you see in the text. And I'm not going to say any more here, even though, of course, there's more to be said about the analysis here. But what does a court decide when they look at Stafford versus Wallace in terms of this notion of the stream of commerce doctrine? That brings us to the sick chicken case. As the book suggests, a lot of what was happening in terms of American economic development at this time is a pretty radically free market approach. So the government did not see its goal as trying to regulate businesses in any way. This meant that there were a lot of practices that were relatively problematic, including, as in this case, the Schechter Poultry Corporation for the United States, the sale of rotten chicken to consumers who were then made sick by it. That was just one of the many things that was going on in the Schechter Poultry case that became relevant. As you can see from my picture here, what we have going with the Schechter Poultry case is another issue of where commerce begins and ends. And specifically, you've got the farm where the chickens are in one state. They are transported in some way to another state, typically an urban area, where they are slaughtered and prepared for human consumption. Oftentimes, this becomes one of the failures. In this case, what we're looking at is ways in which the National Industrial Recovery Act could be used to help create trade practices, wage and hour practices, as well as health and safety codes that would help protect consumers from, in this case, the distribution of sick and rotten chicken. As you know from reading the case, we're not very successful here. So there are some issues in terms of how we develop interstate commerce that are worth looking at. First of all, this question of what is in interstate commerce. I'll move to this so that you don't have to look at that picture anymore. So first of all, you have this notion of what's in interstate commerce and whether or not the poultry in the Schechter case is in interstate commerce. And one of my favorite lines in this case, which I have to say because it's one of my favorite lines, has to do with the flow of commerce doctrine. So we already know that if you are in the flow of commerce and you have to stop and something happens to you as a product or happens to the product, it remains in the flow of commerce, and so Congress can regulate that. But these chickens, it's questioned, are no longer in the flow of commerce, or at least that's part of what's going on in this case. So the question is, are they in commerce? And the court says, and this is on page 422, if you're interested, there's a couple quotes I'm going to read. The first is the interstate transaction, this is at the top column of 422. The interstate transactions in relation to that poultry then ended. Defendants held the poultry at their slaughterhouse markets for slaughter and local sale to retail dealers and butchers, who in turn sold directly to consumers. Neither the slaughtering nor the sales by defendants were transactions in interstate commerce. So the slaughtering and sale of chickens happens after the interstate commerce has ceased. And they go on to elaborate on this, and this is one of my favorite parts of the case. The mere fact that there may be a constant flow of commodities into a state does not mean that the flow continues after the property has arrived and has become commingled with the mass of property within the state and is there held solely for local disposition and use. So far as the poultry here in question is concerned, the flow in interstate commerce has ceased. The poultry had come to a permanent rest within the state. So my favorite line is the poultry had come to a permanent rest in the state. Obviously, that means commerce's or the interflow of interstate commerce has ended, and so Congress's ability to regulate these chickens is over. Never mind that people were getting sick. So this gives us a sense of how the scope of interstate commerce will flow. And again, if you go back to the picture, it ends here. This chicken is at rest, and this person is sick. The Schechter case does something else, right? Because again, there's a couple issues that become relevant when we're looking at interstate commerce. One is this notion of the flow of commerce and where, and of course, the other is whether or not there is a direct effect of whatever the condition Congress is trying to regulate in terms of commerce. And so in this case, they're looking at this notion of direct effect, and they distinguish it between a direct and an indirect effect. And so there's a lot of language in this case also that deals with the fact that what they're trying to regulate here is direct or is indirect and not a direct effect. So on page 423 at the top of the page, let me just quote one more thing before we move on. The distinction between direct and indirect effects of intrastate transactions, right? So at the point something has gone into intrastate, you may still regulate it if it has a direct effect on interstate, but that's not the case here, they're arguing. Intrastate transactions upon interstate commerce must be recognized as a fundamental one, essential to the maintenance of our constitutional system. Otherwise, as we have said, there would be virtually no limit to the federal power, and for all practical purposes, we would have a completely centralized government. So Schechter is trying to limit federal power by saying that there has to be a direct effect on interstate commerce by any kind of intrastate work in order for Congress to regulate. In this case, they don't meet the bar. Now, that's going to change, of course, as we know. But here, they're trying to make the case that what's happening within the state remains state business. So you can also see, as we were talking about the other day, there's a lot of implications for the system of federalism and what remains a state versus a federal issue. And again, remember that here, Congress is trying to regulate wages, working conditions. They're trying to regulate health and safety codes in terms of how the chicken is produced, in part because people are getting sick. All of this, it's argued by the court, is intrastate, not interstate. This doesn't last. Let me go back really fast before we go forward. And this will be the last little bit before I take a break, and this is the end of section 2, or part 2. The Schechter case is followed by Carter versus Carter Coal Company, which is why question 5, the one that you're going to be answering, is elaborate on this notion of direct and indirect effect from Schechter and Carter. Both of these cases help us understand what constitutes a direct and an indirect effect on interstate commerce. Here we're still working under the understanding that what happens intrastate remains only relevant from the point of view of regulating at the state level, and that the federal government can only begin to regulate once it hits the interstate component, unless there is a direct effect. So the question is, what does that mean? What does it mean to have a direct effect? And so the 5th question that you want to answer, or that you should answer, is to elaborate on this and to use some of the specific language from both Schechter and Carter in your elaboration. And so here's going to end part 2 of the Interstate Commerce Clause. Part 3 is going to go through the court packing, and we're going to move on to the next case. And so I will talk to you in a moment.